Good afternoon and welcome. I am Teresa Rajak-Talley, Dalhousie University Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and a member of the organizing committee for today's event. It is with great pleasure that on behalf of the organizing committee, I formally welcome you to this virtual pre-conference event. We begin with a land acknowledgement. Dalhousie University and King's College are located in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We recognize that we are all beneficiaries of the Peace and Friendship Treaty and pay homage to the elders. Dalhousie University and the Universities of King's College, in partnership with the Black Cultural Center, are hosting the first ever in Canada, the University Studying Slavery Conference. Because of the COVID pandemic, we had to reschedule the in-person conference for fall of 2023, right here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Until then, we are organizing a series of virtual pre-conference events like this one, so stay tuned. This virtual pre-conference on slavery and reparation is being broadcasted from Nova Scotia, which has been the home for over 400 years to the oldest Black communities in Canada. The UN Declaration of the International Decade for People of African Descent recognized that African Nova Scotia are a distinct founding people in Nova Scotia and have and continue to play an important role in the province's culture and history, as well as to many positive contributions to Dalhousie University, King's College, the Maritimes, Canada, and the diaspora. As the organizing committee deliberated on a theme for the conference, we recall scholar Francis Henry's 1973 publication titled Forgotten Canadians and Blacks of Nova Scotia. This major international conference hosted here is therefore very important, as oftentimes Canada is forgotten in the triangle of slavery and British colonialism. It is within this context that we have selected as the overarching theme for the conference, Slavery and Reparations, African Nova Scotia, Canada, and beyond. This conference comes at a time when we are experiencing the worst two pandemics in our lifetime. Under one pandemic, the coronavirus, we are forced to recognize the disparities in the health system based on race, ethnicity, social class, and geography. The other pandemic, the violence of racism experienced globally, is not new. Neither is it alien to our individual societies, institutions, and communities. This conference forum is designed so we can talk to each other and walk the talk. It begins with the history of slavery and extends to the contemporary repercussions and persistence of racial, socioeconomic, gender, and other social inequities and disparities, and their intersections stemming from colonialism. We will debate these issues, but cannot deny or avoid the systemic nature of racism as a result of this history, nor the continued brutality, pain, loss, and disenfranchisement of individuals, groups, communities, and countries who continue to overcome many challenges in order to thrive and be successful. Colleagues, it took decades for the academy to acknowledge the relationship between their institutions and colonialism. However, there now exists a group of universities studying slavery. Out of the University of Virginia in the US grew a multi-institutional collaborative effort to address the legacies of slavery, including issues of race, inequality, and inequity in higher education, and for us in Canada, for Black and Indigenous peoples. There are a few universities in Canada that have joined their US counterparts. Dalhousie University and the University of King's College are leading in this movement. Both universities were among the first to formally investigate the historical links to slavery, which can be found in the report on Lord Dalhousie, History on Slavery, and Race, Kings, and Slavery, a Scholarly Inquiry. For those of you who do not know us, Dalhousie University is Atlantic Canada's leading research-intensive university, a key driver of the region's intellectual, social, and economic development for over 200 years. Located in the heart of Halifax with an agriculture campus in Truro Bible Hill. Dalhousie is truly a national and international university with more than half of our 20,000 students coming from outside of the province. Dalhousie's most recent strategic plan, 2021 to 2026, stresses its role as a civic university, its inclusive excellence, and its commitment to Black and Indigenous populations, including of the African Nova Scotians and the Mi'kmaq communities, amongst other equity-deserving groups. Dalhousie also recently endorsed the Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism and Black Inclusiveness in Higher Education. The University of King's College was established in 1789 and is Canada's oldest chartered university, a small and extraordinary lively academic community located in Halifax, Nova Scotia. King's is known nationally and internationally for its highly acclaimed interdisciplinary programs in the humanities and journalism, including in its renowned foundation year program. King's College is also an active participant in Dalhousie's initiatives and programs for Black and Indigenous populations, while continuing to address the recommendations from its own scholarly inquiry report on race, kings, and slavery. Colleagues, from the very inception of this conference, the organizing committee was committed to partnering with the African Nova Scotia community. The Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia agreed to partner with Dalhousie and King's and has taken the responsibility of making sure that there is involvement of African Nova Scotians from throughout the province. The center was established in 1983 as a provincial museum and community gathering place with a mandate to protect, preserve, and promote the rich history of one of Canada's founding cultures. People of African descent have called Nova Scotia home since the 16th century and have made a significant impact as the birth of Black culture and heritage in Canada. The center features exhibits, artifact collection that shares this little known history through programs, displays, and outreach both provincially and nationally. We will host part of this conference at the center to allow participants to visit and learn. Dear participants, we have two excellent events organized today as part of our pre-conference virtual lunch. At 6 p.m. Atlantic time, we welcome Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, who's a global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. Dr. Beckles has achieved recognition internationally for his academic contributions and leadership expertise. He's a lead protagonist on slavery and reparation. But we now begin with a very insightful panel. I'm so excited, who are representatives of the global, North American, and local perspectives. We anticipate very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentations that will engage us in challenging but healthy discussion on slavery's role in higher education, its legacies and impact on contemporary conditions, and the international movement for reparation and redress. The panel will be facilitated by the conference chair, Dr. Isaac Saney. But before I hand over to Dr. Saney, I would like to thank the organizing committee for their dedication, hard work, and courage in organizing today's event. You, the panelists, and you, the audience, for giving of your time to listen, to learn, and act with us. Dr. Saney. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Teresa Rajak-Tally, who is doing very important work here at Dalhousie University and has played a key role, along with other members of our organizing committee, to organize this very, very important conference and these virtual events. Before I proceed and introduce our August, and I think what will turn out to be a very insightful panel, I'd like our participants who are listening to understand that if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the question and answer chat that's available. The overall chat has been disabled for this session, but you can put your questions there and we'll have a question and answer period. We're also recording this and the keynote event for later broadcast, later sharing with people, as I think you will find the insights quite powerful. Well, we kick off today's virtual event with 3 stellar panelists. I'm going to introduce them and then I'll go to the first panelist. They'll be speaking in the order of Cikiah Thomas, Delvina Bernard, and Dr. Andrea Thomas. Cikiah Thomas is the chairperson of the International Working Committee of the Global African Congress, which is campaigning for governments to issue an apology for reparations and slavery. Based in Toronto, Cikiah is a longtime community activist and a former public servant. He was an active participant at the United Nations World Conference Against Racism held in South Africa in 2001, a historic conference. In 2002, he was a key planner of the African and African Descendant World Conference Against Racism. The Global African Congress, known by its acronym GAC, was created out of the conference. Cikiah was elected its chair in 2002 and has continued in the role. The Global African Congress strives to accomplish its goal of equitable distribution of global resources by demanding reparatory justice, advocating for policies that combat institutional racism, and working to ensure respect for all Africans everywhere. As chair of the Global African Congress, Cikiah developed strategies to link with trade unions, youth, women, farmers, students, and professionals. Now organized in 20 nations, its constitution is considered by many to be a model of Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. I've also had the great privilege of working with Cikiah Thomas, and I can sort of testify to his incredible commitment, dedication, and insight. Cikiah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Hello, fellow panelists. First of all, let me thank the organizers for this exciting conference, and thank you for inviting me. What I will attempt to do is to share some background information on Canada. And I want to place it in the context of my experience in the global reparation struggle. When we speak of reparations, we talk about Canada. It's a strange phenomenon. And therefore, I think it's embedded upon us to set the record straight. And I will start off by saying it is not generally known inside or outside of Canada that Canada was a major slave-owning country and contributes significantly to the rape of Africa and the degradation and dehumanization of Africa. The fact that Canada owned slaves, exploited and abused them from 1628 to about 1833 has been one of Canada's best kept secret. In the typical Canadian way, this fact has been obscured by the preeminent stories of Canada's role in the Underground Railroad and this country being a sanctuary for slave-freeing United States. In Canada of 2021, there is still a strong resistance to acknowledge the truth of this country's shameful slave-owning past. There is, therefore, a concomitant reluctance to recognize officially the implication of Canada's slavery and its direct connection to the condition of African Canadian today, present-day institutionalized and structural anti-Black, anti-African racism and racial injustice. Slavery in Canada, the condition that imposed on the country's Blacks, and the attitude it bred in the white slave-owning class are manifested in a number of ways that spread to the lingering pathology in the social and psychological body of the country. The manifestation has been sharpened by evidence of similar conditions faced by Blacks in the diaspora and the African continent. This evidence is actually the result direct of hundreds of years of African slavery and colonization. This has been and continues to be used as justification for the differential treatment of Blacks. At the core is the blatant, institutionalized, and structural anti-Black racism. We need to constantly reestablish the reestablishment of the tenet of white supremacy and justification for supremacy behavior. Africans are known to have been in Canada since the 1500s. However, it was not until the early 1600s that the first known African arrived, Matthew de Costa, a free man. However, the largest number of Africans entered Canada as slaves since the 1600s. Since the 1600, Africans have lived in every region of the country. Today, African Canadians reside mainly in Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and tend to favor the urban center. In these centers, African Canadians are at the bottom of the economic and social ladder, irrespective of the length of time over which they have resided in various areas. The typical African Canadian experience is daily, being subjected to discrimination, negative profile, and denial of access and opportunity, essential for health and advancement. The African Canadian community in Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Halifax, and other areas of concentration endure the continuing crisis characterized by low income, high rate of unemployment and underemployment, and concomitant to poverty, denial of normal entitlement, deprivation of social amenity, ghettoization of housing areas, homelessness, and family breakdown. Disproportionate high level of student suspension, expulsion due to the Safe School Act, high level of school dropout and push out, exclusion from higher education opportunity, social condition and political marginalization reflecting community underdevelopment, hopelessness and despair, high incidence of health problem, physical and mental within the community, overrepresentation of African Canadian in the prison system, the number of African Canadian youth being seduced by inappropriate role model and gun culture and turning into lifestyle of violence and criminal activity. Periodic acts of violence by some of our youth, multiple inequality, intersectionality, and the reinforcement of each other across generation. These conditions are created by institutionalized and structural racism, especially anti-Black racism, and is inherent in the discrimination created from slavery and colonization. Government at the federal, provincial, and municipal level have a powerful history of trying to resolve these issues. Typically, they have commissioned reports and then ignore the recommendations. At the root of their failure to resolve past crisis is a faulty diagnosis of the issue, application of wrong and inappropriate policy, white supremacy ideology, short span attention of the problem. Importantly, they refuse to acknowledge that anti-Black racism are at the core of the problem, partly because the impact of racism is not fully understood. I do not wish for it to understood its connection with the enslavement of African people. I want to share this perspective with you as part of the present day problem. I want to also highlight that in the global reparation campaign, as we move from different regions, we begin to highlight the problems in Canada. Some very good reparation activists themselves have difficulties in understanding what exactly we are talking about, because Canada is seen as the haven for Black people. That is, as mentioned before, because of the Underground Railroad. So those of us as reparation activists in Canada have a double task. Not only do we have to educate our fellow reparation activists and fellow reparative justice campaigner, we have to do a tremendous amount of education, not like similar area like Caribbean, Latin America, or even Africans in Europe or the United States. So we have a unique opportunity having to debunk a wide range of myths. So our task is that much more difficult, one that we should not overlook, and should not attempt to underutilize as we pursue our reparation campaign. With that, I will close here and leave open for some questions.
Thank you, Cikiah, for being so brief, but yet so poignant in your comments. And I think obviously we will have a room for very significant discussion. Of course, one of the interesting things was when you spoke about the persistence of anti-Black racism. There was, of course, the 2017 report of the United Nations Working Group on Experts that I think shocked many people in exposing the nature of anti-Black racism in the so-called Canada, the country that is seen in many cases as free of racism, and somehow a country that did not experience colonialism. Our next speaker is Delvina Bernard. Delvina Bernard is currently a PhD candidate at St. Mary's University with a dissertation topic focusing on examining reparations and models of reparatory justice for historic inequities, including slavery and economic underdevelopment. She's also Mount St. Vincent University's Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Advisor, a continuation of the vocation that has shaped her life's work. Delvina is a sixth-generation African Nova Scotian who traces her Canadian ancestry to the Black United Empire Loyalists of 1783 and the Black refugees of 1812. She has been instrumental in the growth and development of the Canadian Afrocentric education movement and is a recognized advocate for Indigenous rights, gender equality, and social equity for marginalized populations. I've also known Delvina very, very well, and have also stood shoulder to shoulder in many struggles in the African Nova Scotian community. Delvina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me to participate in this dialogue. It's very exciting. I'm looking forward to the conference face-to-face that will happen. My brother Cikiah there returned some time to the chair because I think he knows that I'm long-winded. So he was offering that to me. I'm just gonna take that as a measure. My presentation, I've titled it Pipeline to Prosperity, Slavery's Impact on Contemporary Conditions for Black Nova Scotians. And Brother Cikiah offered an amazing overview of sort of the national historical constructs that, you know, Canada has been able to try to dodge in terms of its history of enslavement. And so I'm going to get a bit more granular and share with you and the audience, our international audience, some of the sort of important issues about the status of the reparatory justice movement in Nova Scotia, because this is an amazing opportunity for all of us in terms of the reparatory justice movement. And I want to just share what is happening here in Nova Scotia, and because it is kind of a window to what's happening in Canada as well. So I'm going to kind of like try to read through this a bit because I want to make sure I stay at least close to time. I promise to be a bit more animated in the Q&A. So a new discourse and approach to African Nova Scotian development has been ushered in by the global discussion of reparatory justice and the new social change theories being advanced by reparations scholars who are challenging Eurocentric narratives of what transpired during the past 500-year epoch of African history and Western development. This paradigm shift in regards to how to approach the development of African people in Nova Scotia and elsewhere in the diaspora does not stop at the level of ideology. Reparations scholars are by and large activist scholars, which means we are simultaneously challenging social institutions, governments, corporations, as well as local and global leaders. It's my assertion that a reparations mindset offers an expanded toolkit for challenging neoliberal models of development, which are largely trapped in their own Eurocentric economic models and discourse. Such models of development, which are steeped in exploitation and grew out of African people and on the backs of African people and enslaved people in our enslaved labor, were never intended to give agency to the development of African people. These Eurocentric models of development are the very reason why African people in Nova Scotia and elsewhere in the world are largely living in a state of social, cultural, political, and economic underdevelopment. We all know Walter Rodney's work, How Colonialism Underdeveloped Africa, and the fact that it's a well-researched and documented account which supports this argument of development. And likewise, I love the piece that was done by Manning Maribel, his work, which is called How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. And it also supports that assertion. My own research on reparatory justice in Nova Scotia, which I must say is still in its infancy, could aptly be titled How Racism Underdeveloped Nova Scotia, and in particular, Black Nova Scotia. So in this brief presentation, I want to share three critical perspectives of reparations in Nova Scotia, and then this lens to Canada as a whole too. And I'm going to use the African Nova Scotian lens to highlight my points. My choice to use the Black Nova Scotian political lens is not just because I live here in Nova Scotia, but rather because Nova Scotia is really the historic mecca or nexus and genesis of the Black experience in Canada. And even though the population of Black people in Nova Scotia is smaller than that of those in, say, Ontario or Quebec, Nova Scotia is home to the oldest Black communities in Canada, as Brother Cikiah has pointed out, and the largest communities of Indigenous Blacks who have been in Canada since the mid-1700s. So by way of a brief sort of a context on the first major group of arrivals to the province, they were known as the Black Loyalists. And I'll just share this for those who might be new to this conversation. They were given this title because they answered a proclamation issued by British Royal Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunsmore, who offered freedom to enslaved Blacks who would be daring enough to desert their slave owners to join the British Army during the American War of Independence, which began in 1775, as we all know. Dunsmore referred to this army of freedom-seeking Black soldiers as his Ethiopian regiment. However, as history has taught us, the British lost that war. So in 1783, Dunsmore's Black Loyalists were settled in Nova Scotia, creating the largest settlement of free Blacks in the British Empire. What research clearly shows us is that unlike the Scottish, the British, French, the German, and others who came here to unrightfully occupy the lands of indigenous nations in this Canada, for people of African descent to Nova Scotia, ours was not a mission of discovery or of expansionism, or even a quest for religious actualization, which was the case of German arrivals. Ours is not a story of pilgrims freely and willingly boarding ships to venture across the Atlantic Ocean unbonded, unindentured, and unbounded. Rather, ours is a story of quest for freedom from chattel slavery and cultural genocide. Ours is a story of an escape plan that involved calculated risk and the possibility of a brutal death at the hands of slave catchers, bounty hunters, if all did not go as planned. Ours was a search for a promised land. So the three critical points, moving forward to these points, I want to share about the status of reparations movement in Nova Scotia, Canada. I'll introduce these as three separate questions, which are, number one, what are the critical factors that have current Indian reparations debate? Second, is there a need for an alternative way when it comes to development of African descended people in Canada? And more importantly, how does reparatory justice factor into this? And the third question is there a need to adopt a theoretical framework to underpin reparations, ideology, and strategies? In other words, as we begin to theorize about reparations, what philosophical framework will we ground that theory in? And that's the one that I like discussing the most. So I think everybody here is probably up on, some of the tenets of reparations. But before I kind of go into the three questions, I just want to make sure that people on this call who may not be are clear on what definition of reparations I'm working with. So let me say that reparations literally means to repair. We know that, to restore or to make amends of a past action. The United Nations guidelines defines reparations as making repair for victims of gross violations of international human rights. And the UN recommends that such victims be entitled to restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and non-repetition of these behaviors, and compensation. And of course, we all know that mainstream media news houses only seem to focus on the compensation and not the other elements, sadly. So the question I have is the first one. Let's start with that first question. What are the critical factors that have propelled the current Nova Scotian debate around reparations? And the first one was already mentioned by Brother Cikiah and Brother Isaac, which is that the 2001 Durban Conference on Anti-Racism, some of the increased attention in Nova Scotia has come from that. It can be traced directly to participation in that 2001 Conference on Anti-Racism. A few rather key African Nova Scotian community influencers, academics, and social justice activists attended that conference, which we know had a huge reparations agenda, that conversation in Nova. But as we all know, the events of 9/11 silenced that conversation for years to come. A second important thing that influenced by creating some awareness around reparatory justice is, of course, the establishment of the GAC. And that formation of the Global African Congress as a response to the conference in the United Nations Conference also impacted us. The GAC, as we know from what Brother Cikiah has said, is fully dedicated to ensuring that enslavement be recognized as a crime against humanity. And the growing presence of the GAC here in Canada and in Nova Scotia has not only raised the consciousness about reparatory justice, but also other parallel important issues such as Indigenous genocide and anti-Black racism. The third one is, I think we all kind of know that the decade for persons of African descent has played a huge role. Both the discourse and activities stemming from this decade have teased out conversations about, restitution, rehabilitation, on all the elements of reparations. And this has been very useful in being able to engage people at the very, very grassroots level, so that this isn't just an academic conversation about reparations or a legal conversations about reparations. In Nova Scotia, people on the ground, grassroots people, because they're involved in a lot of activities around the decade for persons of African descent, are equally engaged in trying to engaging in this debate on reparations. Another one, and I think this fourth one, catalyst, which I feel has been most prominent in elevating the reparations debate in Nova Scotia, is the case being advanced by the CARICOM Reparations Commission. The entire African diaspora is watching this precedent-setting action by CARICOM here in Nova Scotia. There is a small yet engaged cluster of Black academics, community development leaders, and social justice activists who are in close conversation with those leading the Caribbean reparations movement. And again, as we see by this event here today, where Black faculty at our universities here in Halifax and our cultural institutions have been taking leadership to engage folks such as Dr. Beckles himself. So CARICOM has been a truly galvanizing force globally, which means us here in Nova Scotia too. We haven't yet graduated to the stage of creating our own reparations commission here in Nova Scotia, or a 10-point plan or anything like that, but I believe it's something that we will surely be engaging with once we have a face-to-face conference, and maybe our slavery conference might be a good opportunity. That's going to happen in 2023. to have conversations once the pandemic restrictions are removed. And lastly, I just want to say that I think because we in Nova Scotia and Canada and everywhere are so connected to the American world, that it's important to note that the 2019 House Judiciary Committee hearings on slavery reparations ignited a fire here. There are lots of conversations that were happening in chat groups and people about what they witnessed. In addition to that, the recent sort of winning vote on April the 14th on that issue has further motivated African Nova Scotians to sort of, make that leap themselves in talking about this. So, but both the US and CARICOM approach of establishing reparations commissions is motivating Nova Scotians, I think, to broaden our conversation beyond sort of beyond the definitional debate to a more focused conversation about actual strategies and the need for establishing a commission and developing reparations models. The second question, very quickly, is that my second question points out that even though Canada is a very affluent country, we still have to ask, is there a need for an alternative economic development model when exploring development for Blacks in Canada? And I think the short answer to this is yes. Here's what I mean. By all sort of international standards, the indices and indexes considers Canada to be economically at the top of the list. The overall standards of living as far as access to healthcare, education, housing, employment, safety, environmental, safety, political freedoms, etc., rank among the highest in the world. But are Black Nova Scotians and Black Canadians equally represented in these good news statistics and indices? Are Blacks sharing in the Canadian dream? I think we know the answer to that. But sadly, the majority, I think, of Black Canadians accept the current economic system at face value. And we don't question, in some ways, the economic status quo, even though we're not the benefactors. The reality is Canada is a capitalist country, no news bulletin here, with an economy that is largely driven by private sector enterprise, no bulletin here again, and the free market. Our economic systems were not created with Blacks in mind. For some, that might be a news bulletin. In our current economic system, is our current economic system structured in a way that can allow the descendants of former enslaved peoples to catch up with the descendants of former slave owners? I don't believe so. How can reparation strategies help Black Canadians achieve economic justice if we accept the system the way it is? So every day we see reports showing the wealth gap between Blacks and whites in Canada, and we see reports that document the impact of intergenerational wealth in maintaining and widening this wealth gap. I think you'll find this afternoon Dr. Beckel's research, because he speaks often about the, sort of the account of the economic and financial implications of reparatory justice. So as we in Canada set out to explore the issues of reparations and economics, we must be prepared to put not only slavery on trial, we must be prepared to put capitalism on trial. We must make the case that our Canadian capitalist economy is not working for Black Canadians and therefore has to answer for itself. We need to be more forceful in exposing the fact that the current economic underdevelopment of African Canadians is a legacy of enslavement, colonialism, and systemic economic neglect, all of which has been fueled by the political economy of capitalist development. Therefore, the African Nova Scotian and African Canadian development trajectory and life world needs to be understood as a feature of its unique economic history of enslavement, of its stolen labor, and unjust enrichment that others have enjoyed from our labor and our status as indentured people, even when we were removed from slavery. So our current state of affairs is not some deficit of the public school system, which we fall back on all the time, or racist employers that won't hire us, or racist police officers. These are just symptoms of the bigger issue of enslavement. And so we have to be more systemic about how we present that and develop strategies coming out of it. We must continue to explore and research and provide documentation of how capitalism and neo-economic policies fly in the face of the reparations principle of the guarantees of non-repetition, because actually research will show that Canadian economic policies are re-victimizing African Canadians and robbing us of basic human rights. We must put the capitalist political economy on trial, not just in so-called developing nations, but here in Canada, which is considered one of the most developed nations in the world. So just slowing down here, I'm at the third question, so I should be tidying up. Is there a need to adopt a theoretical framework to undergird and underpin reparations philosophy, research, strategy, and proposals? Something has happened here. Oh, am I still there? I saw
You're still there. You're still there.
that slide went up by mistake. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just repeat the question. This is my last point, which is there a need to adopt a theoretical framework to undergird and underpin reparations philosophy, research, strategies, and proposals? And again, the short answer is yes. I'm afraid that if we don't have a solid philosophical framework for reparations research and strategies and proposals, we will risk being taken off our own terms. We will risk adopting development models steeped in Eurocentric values, which will not bring agency to our issues of full economic, cultural, and psychological emancipation. In Nova Scotia, our values and customs and beliefs and worldviews are under siege every day. Black communities in this province are disappearing. Our land is being encroached upon by developers and speculators. The one community institution that many communities own, which are in our more than 40 Black communities, is our which serve wide range of services and purposes. But these places, which were once shelters from the Eurocentric storm, are closing daily because our communities are shrinking and being overrun and literally colonized. And of course, our independently established Black schools disappeared in the 1960s during the desegregation movement. So Blacks in Nova Scotia and Canada, we make up only 3% of the population. So just like the Francophone Canadian population, African Canadians live in fear of cultural assimilation and disappearance every day. We struggle every day to maintain our African ways of being, doing, and knowing. We're fighting to keep our culture alive. And many African Nova Scotians believe reparatory justice is an opportunity to reset the clock, turn back the dial, reclaim and protect and preserve our cultural way of life. Reparatory justice offers the hope of being a pipeline to prosperity. However, my assertion here is that in order for this to happen, our reparations efforts must have an underlying philosophical framework that distinguishes us as a unique cultural group and guides us to the agents of our own best interests. Just winding up, my belief is that the reparations movement needs a philosophical framework and ideology anchored in Afrocentricity. Because African people have been decentered and placed on the periphery of European history and experiences and narratives, any and all reparations research programs and proposals need to be grounded in Afrocentric theory. One of my intellectual, I should say, and academic mentors over the past 25 years has been the world-renowned scholar and father of contemporary Afrocentricity movement, Dr. Malafi Asante. And he has said, he's always asserted that any and all African development must adopt a frame of reference wherein all phenomena are viewed from the perspective of the African person. And Dr. Asante points out that an Afrocentric philosophy of reparations will break the bonds of Western domination in the minds of African people in the same way we broke the bonds and chains of chattel slavery. So to wrap up on this last point, I want to mention that I've thoroughly examined the US and Caribbean 10-point plans for reparations, and both I think could benefit from a more intentional Afrocentric theoretical framework. I also think both could offer a stronger and more radical critique of white supremacy and the capitalist political economy. I mean, if you listen to anyone who's involved in reparations movements, I know this is implied. I know this is implied. When you look at the 10-point plans of both, it's very much implied. I just think that there is value in being more explicit. I'll end by saying, if African Nova Scotians and African Canadians in general truly embrace reparative justice as a pipeline to prosperity, we must be prepared to adopt an Afrocentric philosophical framework in every aspect of what we do. And in closing, at some other point when we have more time, I would love to talk more and examine the issues of reparations in Nova Scotia by examining the history of slavery in Nova Scotia, systemic and racial discrimination of the land granting system when we came as loyalists, and also separate and unequal schools, as well as the social exclusion of Blacks here, the Jim Crow in Canada. So with that, thank you, Isaac, and I thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you, Delvina, for that comprehensive presentation. And I think one of the central themes is that reparations is more than just simply compensation. It involves a radical, shall we say, transformation of economic and social relations, and of course psychological relations within society. I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion and question and answers that come up to the Q&A period. Before we move to our last but not least speaker on the panel, I'd like to remind people that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. You can click on it and you'll be able to type in your answers, and the panelists will be more than willing to respond to them. Our third speaker on the panel today is Dr. Andrea Thomas. Dr. Andrea Douglas, my apologies. Dr. Andrea Douglas is the director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. She was recently appointed to the Governor's Commission to study slavery and subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination. She's also the co-chair of the President's Commission on the Age of Segregation at the University of Virginia, and sits on Monticello's Advisory Committee on African American Affairs, as well as the state's History of Lynching in Virginia Working Group. Dr. Douglas has served on the City of Charlottesville Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Monuments, and Public Spaces. We've all seen the debate, the rich debate, the powerful debate that's emerged in the United States over what monuments and what statues and what commemorations takes place. She's also served in the University of Virginia's President's Commission on Slavery at the university, and was chair of the city's Place Design Task Force. She holds an MA and a PhD in art history from the University of Virginia, and an MBA in arts management and finance from Binghamton University in New York. Dr. Douglas has taught graduate and undergraduate classes in African American contemporary and art theory, and has published exhibition catalogs and scholarly articles. From 2004 to 2010, she was the curator of collections and exhibitions and curator of contemporary art at University of Virginia's Art Museum. Without further ado, it's a privilege to have you, Dr. Douglas. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen, and I apologize, Delvina, because it was me who caused you to disappear for a minute there. Sorry about that.
I should have just read your slides and tried to claim them as my own, but that would be plagiarism.
Well, these may not, they're somewhat interesting, so hopefully you might want something in there after I'm through. So here it is. So I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me here to speak today. It is a fairly important sort of juxtaposition, my being here today and actually what's happening in Charlottesville in relationship to this notion of reparations, because today is the first day of the trial of those people who created the United the Right rally in 2017, and they are being brought. The case is being brought by those people who were victims of the violence that occurred on August 12th. And so we're sitting here today while that is going on, and then tomorrow is the election for governor of the state of Virginia, which, if our Democratic governor or candidate does not win, will really result in some redressing of some of the work that we've been doing over the course of the last call it 6 years or so since 2016 to move forward the idea of, if not economic reparations, certainly the notion of repair and restorative justice that we've been engaged in Charlottesville. I was asked to talk a little bit about the state of reparations in America, which I felt was a really large topic for someone like me who's only just come to this conversation recently as a consequence of the varied committees and commissions that I've been appointed to. And certainly did not feel that I could offer a learned discourse on the notions of reparations in America, given that this is a process that has begun as an official act as early as 1894, when Callie House and Reverends Isaiah Dickerson and Augustus Sparks founded the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty and Pension Association. So what I hope to offer today is some comments about the work that we've been doing at the commission level, certainly in the age of segregation at the university, and then also some of the outcomes from the commission on slavery at the university, which then ultimately the work is being continued by the USS, which is the university studying slavery, and on which I've most recently begun to participate with my colleague and co-chair of the Commission on Segregation, Kurt Van Dock. So my comments will be in form of something that Kurt and I like to joke about, which is stumbling toward repair, as opposed to offering a clear and distinctive example of how repair can be addressed. It is only recently, I could say, that as we think about, or as I think about the work that I've been engaged in, it's only recently, having now joined the commission, the Governor's Commission on the Study of Slavery and Subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans. And even an acronym would not make that an easy title of a commission to articulate. That the work that I've been doing has not really even addressed this notion of economic repair in a substantive way. It's only in Virginia, in terms of universities offering some economic recompense to descendants of enslaved people at universities, that has occurred only within this most recent year. But we have been certainly within the scope of the commissions since 2013, been attempting to create some space where conversations can occur around what repair could and should look like. And so in some ways, this is what I'm trying to describe for you as I move through these slides. Just wanted to make sure I check my time. And Delvina mentioned the 10 points of some of the ideas of repair that are being addressed in the United States. And I am going to repeat those based on some assertions that Dr. Iva Carruthers has made most recently at one of our commission meetings. And she offered these 10 points for the commission to think about. Number one, a formal apology. Number two, the right of repatriation and the creation of African knowledge programs. The right to land for social and economic development, funds for cooperative enterprise, resources for healthcare, education, resources for affordable housing, a strengthened combination of information and communication infrastructure, preserving Black sacred sites and monuments, and repairing damage for criminal injustice. And I can say in some ways that, again, while not specifically addressing that, the work of the commission the President's Commission on Slavery and the President's Commission in the Age of Segregation has attempted to try and address some of those 10 points in one form or another. And so some of what I've been asked also to talk about is what is the progressive role universities can play in this space of reparations. And this is where these slides, I hope, will take us. As far as the first point, which is this notion of formal apology, what you're looking at on the screen is in fact the University of Virginia's attempt at a formal apology, where it placed a plaque that is in the entryway to the rotunda, which is the main building in the academical village at the university. And the plaque reads, in honor of the several hundred women and men, both free and enslaved, whose labor between 1817 and 1826 helped to realize Thomas Jefferson's design for the University of Virginia. And so in real ways, for a very long time, this was the only way that the university actually even acknowledged the notion that the university was created by someone other than its illustrious founder, Thomas Jefferson. And this plaque sparked some activism on the part of its students at the university, sparked activism on the part of certain members of its faculty, and certainly the part of those members of our community who had been involved for quite some time in the study of African-American history from the point of view of descendant work in our community. And this idea of moving toward repair, or how not to forget anymore, is really where I think that universities and some of the commissions that I sit on begin the work, and that's the work of education. The quote that you're looking at is by Isabella Gibbons, who was enslaved at the university. We know that she was able to read and write while she was enslaved. And by 1867, as a free person, she is one of the teachers at the Jefferson School, which is where the institution that I actually work for is housed. The Jefferson School begins as a freedmen's school and a normal school in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1865. And Isabella Gibbons becomes a teacher there in 1867. I mean, I'm sorry, in 1866. And in 1867, in the year of universal suffrage, she says, can we forget the crack of the whip, cowhide, whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader, tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten those horrible cruelties? Hundreds of our race have been killed. No, we have not, nor ever will. And for me, at the African American Heritage Center, these words are at the entry of our exhibition that tells the history of the Black community that is formed post-emancipation and continues as a part of the community in Charlottesville until an active part of the community, I would say, until the moment in 1865, where urban renewal removes its urban center. But at the moment that Isabella is making this statement, she is responding to her understanding of enslavement in Albemarle County, where the University of Virginia resides, both in Albemarle County and as well in at the university. And so admonishing us in the future and those students that she would be speaking to at the Jefferson School to never forget. And I think this is a really telling and poignant moment in the overall history of the commission's work and of enslavement, generally speaking. And so the myth, trying to create an intellectual genealogy, what we understand that is that the state of Virginia, in terms of understanding American racial politics, is really a nexus point, just as Nova Scotia would be. 40% of the state is enslaved in 1860 in that census. And in Albemarle County, in that same census, 50% of Albemarle County is enslaved at that time. We are looking at how do we reconcile those numbers even with those institutions. And again, Virginia and Charlottesville or Albemarle County is again another sort of nexus point, because our understanding of public education begins with Jefferson. He sees it as a space that is education important as a marker against tyranny, but in fact he acknowledges his university as a space to protect the young Southern gentleman from Northern ideals. And so we have to, in the work that we do, acknowledge his own white supremacy that begins the understanding of racial politics in that space, and the role that the university plays in promulgating that. And this sort of begins as early as 1832, where students are debating this notion of emancipation, and the faculty puts a gag rule on that. These are commensurate with Black people's own desire for liberation. In 1830, we know that the abolitionist movement begins. And so the university's deep relationship to enslavement, its deep relationship to developing the ideology around enslavement, around what we now describe as legalized apartheid, that is the Jim Crow period. It has this nexus in this place. And so more documentation of the commitment from that place to the notion of white rule. And as that commitment extends into not just the university space, but also into the community and the development of ideals such as the lost cause narrative, which comes directly from people like Jubal Early, who in where I live, there's a town called Earlysville that's named after him. And as we talk about this legalized apartheid and how when the university raises the Confederate flag in 1861, declares itself part of the Confederacy and acknowledges the Articles of Secession, those students/soldiers come back and become commensurate and engaged in a level of white rage against the very community in which the university lives. And it is exampled in the public sphere. This is a comic that was talking about Vinegar Hill, which is the Black neighborhood that I referred to that was removed in 1965 through urban renewal. And you can see that this comic was in one of the university publications. And so directly taking the sort of racist ideology derived from the university and associating it with the community in which it lives. The university spent $1,000 to support the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, in the 1920s, and some members of its faculty were engaged members of the Ku Klux Klan. The university's involvement in the pedagogy and the creation of public policy around how we understand African-American criminal injustice, as I described earlier. And so thinking about what commissions can do and what are the process that we engage with in terms of that, the idea that we are involved in research and acknowledging our findings publicly, that we must be open and transparent, that we must be community-based, realizing that scholarship does not just exist in the hallowed halls of the university, but also exists in the communities that surround these institutions that are largely engaged in a continued oppression of Black people. And how do we then bring that information to the fore so that that community can be made aware of it and then engage in the solutions moving forward? For us at the commission, the mantra is acknowledge, engage, atone, and educate. And that begins, as I said, with our community, and largely, most recently, with our descendant community. Virginia has been at the head of creating a descendant community that involves not just the University of Virginia, but also involves the many historic homes, such as Monticello and Montpelier and Ashland, which are just within a stone's throw of each other in our area. So really connecting with the community and connecting with descendants, creating opportunities for truth telling, such as permanent exhibitions. This one is in the Rotunda at the university. And then this one is at the Jefferson School, and how we work in tandem to make sure that not just those who live in our community, but those who visit our community have an opportunity to access this history as well. The kinds of colloquia and symposia that you all are engaging in today are part of the ways in which we have attempted to acknowledge and educate our community. And to make it, as I said, as visible as possible throughout our spaces. So the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers is the most recent and certainly the most acclaimed opportunity to do that. Along the rim of this circle are the 4,000 names of those people who were enslaved, both borrowed and owned by Jefferson and others to create the university. And this is not, this sort of site sits in direct relationship to the Rotunda, and so creates a kind of tension between the histories of the university and the histories of the people that built the university and continue to live in the community around it. And just a close-up of that for you. James Monroe, for instance. And so where we are today in terms of thinking about where we go, you know, the energy that we've put into the last few years of work, beginning certainly in 2013 with the Commission on Slavery, and now almost 8 years later, we've started to see a little bit of pushback, and really not a lot, a little bit of pushback, a lot of pushback from the alumni whose graduation dates are, you know, from the 1960s, the 70s, and the early 80s. And they are really wanting to create a space in opposition to the kinds of openness that we've been advocating for recently. Most recently, a blog appeared called the Jefferson Council, which with a masthead that said, "Preserving Thomas Jefferson's legacy at the University of Virginia," and creating an alliance with other universities like VMI and Washington and Lee, two of which most recently have been through a bill very much like HR 40, which was the original 1989 bill from that was started by Detroit Representative John Conyers in 1989. This bill for Virginia would demand that the universities owned by the state of Virginia begin to pay some level of atonement through this Enslaved Ancestors College Access Scholarship and Memorial Program. These universities, VMI, Longwood, UVA, all have until June 2022 to come up with some plan that would then create a level of repair for those descendants of enslavement at these universities. And so the pushback from this group is not just from a single group, but they've come together now to form a consortium of 3 colleges so far of alumni who are standing in opposition to this notion of woke ideology that they believe is becoming pervasive in certainly at UVA and at these other institutions, and see all of the work that we've done to this point as a threat to free speech, to free expression, a threat to independent inquiry. So this idea of what's next and how far we go, as I sit here in the middle of a trial, in the middle of trying to figure out what happens to our symbols of Confederate, of the symbols of the legacy of the lost cause and of legal apartheid. You know, in Virginia, we've removed some of our monuments, but there are many, many more. There are 300 in the state of Virginia. There are still over 50 of them in front of federal courthouses. And so sitting in a place where we're starting to see more and more a pushback from those very universities that are beginning to address these kinds of questions makes us really have to ask ourselves the question, what's next? How do we continue this stumble towards repair? Thank you for the opportunity to present this all to you. And I look forward to any questions that might have come up.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas, for really underscoring that at the end of the day, this project of reparations is about rendering accounts with history, the history of slavery, white supremacy, and continual and ongoing anti-Black racism and the attendant oppression. And that scholarship is not some sort of decorative artifact. It's central to the struggle. And in fact, you know, there can be no just society without truth telling. I think that's a critical point as well. And as we witness the, shall we say, the backlash to things like the 1619 Project and to critical race theory and to the rendering of its history, it reminds me of what Rocky Jones, Dr. Burnley Rocky Jones, who was such an influential person in Canada and in Nova Scotia, in not only the Black community, but Canada as a whole, said, freedom is a constant struggle, and so we're constantly called to the barricades. Before we proceed to the question and answer, I think given the fact that Dr. Douglas has obviously laid out this history of what's happened to people of African descent in the United States and beyond, that we must acknowledge our African ancestors, those kidnapped and ripped from Africa, those, you know, who died on the Middle Passage and bleached the, whose bones bleached the Atlantic, bed of the Atlantic Ocean, those who were then who survived to enslavement in the American plantations and faced the lacerations of their flesh and souls, those who lived through the brutality of segregation, lynching, and other actions against people of African descent. And despite all of this, they asserted their humanity, whether rebelling on the slave ships, rebelling on the plantations, leading struggles against Jim Crow. They have always asserted their humanity. So I think when we talk about reparations, you know, we have questions around compensation. We have questions around whether reparations involve something fundamentally more than just reparations. It involves more than just the spiritual and psychological reparations and rejuvenation of people of African descent. And at the end of the day, it also involves remembering those who not only suffered, but those who struggled to create a better and just world. And I thank you for your presentation, Dr. Douglas. And now we will begin the Q&A, and we have lots of questions for our panelists. And one of the key questions that I think I'll begin with is one that comes from an African Nova Scotian who's very active in the community, Matthew Bayard. I'll get to all the questions, but he asks a very important question here, is how do we get people motivated? How do we get people involved in the reparations movement? And how do we do it in such a way that we don't talk over their heads? And so I throw this out to all of the panelists.
I think I can start by saying, you know, I think one of the things that we have to, that we've already acknowledged is even this term reparations, right? And the kind of fear that that instills in, especially because most people think of it as an economic prospect. And where I live, it's certainly, the majority of the community did not understand reparations until there was an act of violence that occurred in August 12th. And that was when people were much more open to understanding that the nature of economic disparity, the nature of health disparity, the nature of educational disparities that they did not have any understanding of, because Charlottesville, for every reason, is a bedroom community. The economic disparity here is 1.2 million on one end to $25,000 on the other end. And that other end is 35% of the population on that end is the Black population here in Charlottesville. And so this conversation only became consumable within within this space of undeniable truth, right? Even when you think about George Floyd last year and the opportunity to visualize what 9 minutes of a knee on a man's throat could look like, could we be able to get a mass of people engaged in a conversation that around criminal injustice. So I think it is really a long way of saying it is a, how do we personalize this? And so that people see a stake for themselves in the overall conversation about reparations. Because otherwise, even Black people are not so keen necessarily to discuss it, as from my own understanding. Some people believe that we're rocking the boat, you know, that it in of itself is another avenue towards social trauma and harm. So I think it really is to continue to find a way to engage in the personal experience in order to make it real in that way, and remove the sort of distance of history from it, I guess.
Delvina, Cikiah, which one of you would like to go?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Dr. Douglas has said. I don't think there's any one single strategy, one single formula. It's an extremely complex issue. And the complexity of it has to do with white supremacy and colonization of our institutions, our educational institution, our community, employment. We also have to understand the terror of the mind, what George Lamming called the terror of the mind. From my own experience, one of the things that I've learned in the last 2 years, generally, it doesn't matter what part of the world African people are residing. One of the things that I've learned is that, I've learned many things. One that really highlights the whole struggle for reparation for me is that Black people don't like to get white people upset. It's very simple, but Black people do not like to, Black people don't mind another Black person being angry at you. But once a white person get angry at you as a Black person, it's amazing what George Lamming called the terror of the mind. I'm saying this to say that there's no one single formula. Different strategy have to be used. 20 years ago, after the World Conference Against Racism, we have many people who involved in the reparation movement today who would say to me in a very embarrassing, confrontational way at the time, you're looking for a handout, you're looking for another excuse from white people. And in the Canadian context, I could tell you very much that we have church people, for example, who did not want to touch the issue 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the kind of question they're asking. We could look at the number of scholars, Black scholars, who in Canada who are doing research and reparation in different parts of Canada, looking at a holistic approach and confronting some of the complexities, the complex problem in Canada, for example, one troubling issue, where the slavery begins in Canada. So it's not a single formula, it's a complex set of issues that we have to work through. My experience is that as we continue to work and have open discussion and honest discussion, I think we're overcoming the odds, and we just have to keep doing what we're doing.
Delvina?
Yes, I love that question, and I know the asker. Very good question. You know, Afrocentric scholar Dr. Amamazama from Guadeloupe, and following in line with what Brother Cikiah talks about the psychological dislocation. And when I hear Cikiah talk about, yes, it's so true how we are afraid of angering the white populace, absolutely. And this kind of psychological dislocation does sort of keep us disengaged from being agents of our own best interest. I think that one of the ways to answer the asker about, you know, what can we do, it's really does come back to things such as knowing thyself. And when we don't know our own history and culture, we feel undeserving, and that leaves us in a state of psychological dislocation. The other factor too is that as we have started to march towards this conversation about reparations, I have to keep in mind that, you know, some of the global, I guess, education around reparatory justice has come out of the Durban Conference, has come out of the group there. And those were largely a lot of, they weren't all academics. They were unionists, they were community activists, they were intellectuals, many of them were scholars, but that's the group that sort of led a great deal of where we are today. But of more recent times, a lot of what we hear is coming largely from, I guess, historians, professional historians, and legal minds. And so I just think that it's important that in terms of how we air the information, that we give equal attention to those who are actual reparations scholars and legal experts and historians. We need them, and this act of you know, sort of interrogating these things in the academy is essential, while at the same time we have to leave space for community-minded people like those who first were engaged in the Durban Conference to be able to lead a great deal of this work. I mean, you mentioned Dr. Burnley Rocky Jones, Isaac, and a member of his family, her name is Dr. Lynn Jones. One of the, you know, interesting little projects that we must not belittle at all is things like the book that she wrote with kids called R is for Reparations. And that book has done amazing things. We have to start at the level of our kids being taught what reparatory justice is. So projects like that, it doesn't have to just always be the scholarly work that is happening. We have to start the conversation from the very young up to the academics, up to the community activists, the philosophers, in all of the domains that we operate. We have to have this conversation.
Thank you, Delvina. We've had a number of questions that have focused on health. The fact that, you know, reparations must involve more than just simply compensation. And so a number of questions are focused on how do we deal with the question of health, particularly in the face of the COVID pandemic, the fact that communities of color, particularly communities of people of African descent, were particularly more vulnerable to the coronavirus simply because of these inequities. How will reparations address these issues of health inequities and disparities? Who would like to go first on this?
I'll just quickly say this, and I can come back again, which is that one of the things that is encouraging to see in terms of, I mean, we know that we need many point plans as far as addressing, you know, the legacy of enslavement. But the 10-point plan being proposed by the Caribbean, by CARICOM and the American Reparations Organization there too, both of them, you know, really emphasize the need for a concerted program of healthcare to address those issues of why, you know, the social determinants of who we are today, health-wise, have to be explored. You know, why are we, you know, for instance, more susceptible to things like diabetes and hypertension, cholesterol, obesity. These are all and stress disorder. These are all legacies of enslavement. And what I think that if we were to have a research institute focusing on the health of African people in our respective countries or in the diaspora, and relating that research to enslavement, that this will do amazing things in terms of how we develop strategies, proposals for overcoming. It's the same way we, have lots of conversations about overcoming the economic impacts of enslavement or the educational impacts. We've gone further and moved the needle a bit more in those. I think for time immemorial, people kind of thought that, one's health was one's own personal doings. But more and more, as scholars began to research this, and here at Dalhousie University, we're the Black Studies Chair, Dr. Omasari, Dryden, that the work that will happen even in our very own community here, who's hosting this event, will work towards exposing some of these elements of how the legacy of enslavement impacts our health. So I think that staying with that course of action of doing serious research and demanding resources to continue to look at health as it relates to enslavement will advance us.
Anyone else, Dr. Douglas or Cikiah?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. And I like the approach that, and there's so many aspects of reparation that work have not yet begun in terms of establishing research and development institutes. We could name just about as we begin to segment the different component of reparation, we recognize the importance of setting up research and development institute that look at the specificity of each of those areas, and healthcare is no exception. If we think, for example, of just how the Black bodies were used in terms of experimentation during enslavement, if we think of the misinformation, miseducation, and the racist educational system that was developed to justify slavery, just on the surface of that, we could see how even contemporary healthcare professional, how the myth about the Black bodies, the myth, not just about intelligence, but a whole range of things. I remember seeing a newspaper article about Serena Williams going into the hospital to have her baby, and how the doctor seeing this famous Black woman, but have a particular conception and notion of Black women, and how they start to treat her in terms of child delivery. Statistics emerging, and how Black kids, infant mortality rate with Black men, how different it is from white women, and so on. Same thing with Native women. So there's a whole host of specialized area that will have to be carved out. And that's why, for example, I think we always have to be guard against this narrow focus of reparation and just dollars and cents, but see it in the bigger picture of the kind of institution that will have to be developed, the kind of research that has to get into it. And healthcare, by all means, is one. If it's one thing that the pandemic have really illustrated, for example, that on the entire African continent, there's pharmaceutical, I'm thinking about 2 or 3 African countries with pharmaceutical research company. Notwithstanding Africa, it's training hundreds and thousands of skilled people, medical doctor, biochemists, and so on and so forth. Where are they end up in this part of the world? So healthcare is going to be a fundamental when we look at the structural inequality that exists here in this part of the world, in the metropolis, as well as Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. And again, I want to drive home the point that we must see the reparation issue in a holistic approach. We must be very, very, very careful against the tendency to look at one geographical area, that this is a particular problem that's unique to us, as opposed to larger global village of African people.
Dr. Douglas, and perhaps, yeah.
The only thing I would want to add on to that as well is, and I am in full agreement here, is is also not just seeing it as solely about just the specific category of healthcare, but also, as you say, when you're looking at your places of research, we're doing a little bit of research, for instance, here that is around the ownership of property, for instance, and then how that ownership of property results in the receipt of public facilities, public works, like, you know, when do you get your pipes? When do people get their a connection to sewage? When do they get those kinds of real public health apparatuses that allow then for long-term health? So I think I start to think about, you know, the category of health. We also have to also think about those structures that support the capacity to be in good health, which have everything to do with the development of overall social infrastructure in and of itself, right? So, you know, if you don't have a road, you're not getting to the doctor. If you don't have adequate transportation, if you don't have enough adequate sewage treatment, I think all of those things, as you said, it's a very complex set of systems that we have to really interrogate, and in order to come to this real question of how do we solve this particular problem.
Yeah, and I perhaps, thank you for that. And I perhaps from the issue of healthcare, we can look at another system, which is education. So what does education and reparations look like? What does it look like in primary, secondary, and university? Does it involve scholarships, funding of curricula that reflect people of African descent, higher ed support, et cetera, et cetera? And obviously, you know, speaking from Dalhousie University and from obviously all of us being involved somewhere with education and so forth, I think this is a critical question. Perhaps we can start with Delvina and then move on to Cikiah and then Dr. Douglas.
Isaac, before I do that, just a little tiny tidbit on the last question around health. And I just wanted to share this. I remember, we talk a lot about, you know, how North Americans or those of us in the West are addicted to sugar. But often we've never had that conversation in the context of the sugar being king during enslavement in the Caribbean and in Barbados in particular, and in other countries as well. And I remember attending the Dr. George Lamon annual lecture, and Dr. Beckles was given that lecture in Barbados a few years ago when I had an opportunity to hear that lecture. And one of the things he talked about was going to school and kids having, he remembers, would come to school like how you send kids with their recess or little treat, a little brown bag, a little bag full of sugar. And that would be their snack, just pure granulated sugar. Because people's mindsets around sugar and the consumption of sugar, you know, was so normalized in Barbados that no one thought to question the long-term implications of this as a snack on the health of African people and the high rates of insulin resistance and diabetes. And so again, we have to sometimes have these questions. It's interesting. I have shared that with people here, and many people who had a hard time debriefing sugar, once they figured out how much their sugar consumption was tied to the enslavement of Black bodies and exploitation of Black bodies, it gave them direct impetus to say, I'm going to cut sugar for reasons that were political about their history. So very interesting. I just wanted to share that. In terms of education, Isaac, did you want to repeat what angle you wanted to take on that one again, or you want to come back to me?
Sorry, just a question of what would reparations look like in the primary, secondary, university school system? It's a long question, and we have lots of questions. I hope we have 20 minutes left. I know this can be a little tiring, but we have lots of questions, and perhaps some of the central ideas or themes that should be covered and how it should be covered in these various areas of levels of school.
I think that, here in Nova Scotia and in Canada and the United States, I go to the Atlantic to the National Alliance of Black School Educators Conference annually. Went every year since 1998. So I have a sense of, on a national basis, what kind of conversations are happening there as well. And by and large, I would say that in terms of the educational community, we've kind of answered the questions, you know, we've kind of figured out what are some of the interventions that have to happen. We've known for a very long time, whether it's like African-centered schools, whether it's curriculum change, whether it's like increasing the number of people that look like us in the public school system. All these things here in Nova Scotia, we've had, you know, an entire study on redressing inequities in the education system. And we have the solution. We know what they are already. The problem is that we lack the resources. If we could start these cultural schools or Saturday schools or Afrocentric schools or Black-centered schools, if we could have institutions like, you know, Black colleges and universities here in Canada, if we could, you know, have the resources to give scholarships to people to be tooled as educators, and have the kind of monies to help engage parents who don't have the resources to come out, who don't have transportation, that don't have childcare, we would be able to tackle this head on. So really, I don't think we even need to spend a lot of time revisiting what the solutions are. Most of it has to do with the economic engine to be able to actualize and realize the things that we have already figured out. Has been my experience. And that's the frustrating part for most of us who, in myself, I worked in education for over well, at least about 20 years and was an advisor to the Minister of Education on redressing inequities for African Nova Scotian learners. And we had all the solutions, but we just didn't have the resources and the money. 3% of the population is the reality of who we are. And while we may trade on some elements of historical power, it doesn't translate into dollars.
Okay, thank you for that, Delvina. There's
I have a slightly different take on it. I think that is simply probably one of the biggest reparation issue. Because when we begin to talk about the decolonization of educational system, there's so many dimensions, there's so many aspects of it that we have to begin to look at. For example, if one talks about how does an African country or Caribbean country looking at reparation, how do you devise an educational program? Because a Black majority country as opposed to a white majority country. Those of us, as Delvina is reflecting, what our actual lived experiences for those of us who live in our majority society. But if you look at what's happening in the Black majority society, for example, you begin to appreciate the colonization of the educational system and what needs to be done. I'm sure most of you have known of the late scholar Charles Mills, very good friend of mine, philosopher. What happened when he began to look at Blacks in philosophy, for example, and see how philosophy as a subject, how white it is and how Eurocentric it has been. So what do we do in terms of, Delvina's asked a number of questions. What are the philosophical underpinning of reparation? So when we begin to look at the philosophical underpinning of reparation, we have to look how Eurocentric educational system have influenced. So our educational system is not, our education, it's not about the institution itself, but even our community, our family, how we interact with each other. So we have to go through a whole range of decolonization. In other words, we have a series of work, research that have to be done over the next 300 years to unpack the dimension of white supremacy and how it's proliferate every single aspects of our life. So education for me is one of the most fundamental one. It runs in religion, it's run in how we see the world, how we view ourselves, how we view each other. It's a whole different subset of work that has to be done.
We seem to have lost Dr. Douglas. And there was a question that I was going to give to Dr. Douglas, and not only this particular question, but it was going to be a question related to opposition to critical race theory. Oh, there you are, Dr. Douglas. I don't know if you want to wading into discussion education, and perhaps you can answer this. A question directly aimed towards you, aimed at you, for you, actually not aimed at you, but it's a question basically on critical race theory. How is opposition and resistance, right, and suppression of critical race theory, how is that affecting the discussion on slavery and reparations?
Well, I think it goes directly even to the question before about education and how to address that, because in the place where that is showing most is within the realm of education and what is being taught in schools. And when I say that we're in a particular moment, even in Virginia, but largely in the country, where if the Democrats lose this election in Virginia tomorrow, you will see a Republican governor who is against critical race theory being taught in schools. And most of the population here has absolutely no idea what critical race theory is. And for them, it equals African-American history being taught in schools. And it even goes back to where I began with this notion of pushback and the idea not just of critical race theory, but seeing critical race theory as the erasure of whiteness and white history, and for the advocacy of histories that then place, that articulate white supremacy. So we're, I believe, in a very critical moment in our lives in terms of what we are able to move forward in terms of how do we educate. If reparations depends on a large number of people understanding the implications of slavery, and we are on the precipice of not even being allowed to teach that education in our school systems. If you begin to see places like Texas writing out the word slavery altogether out of its textbooks, and instead of calling people enslaved, they're now calling them workers. If you're beginning to see it illegal for teachers to take professional development courses in African-American history, then you can begin to understand that at the very core of the education system, they are attempting to write out this history just at the moment that we are beginning to develop the research that gives us the most authentic history of enslavement and then of legalized apartheid in this country. So it is a very critical moment where we sit. We're in the middle of what is our midterm elections. And as the midterm elections go, so does the elections towards presidency. The Trumpites are still trying to control the electorate by limiting voting opportunity, by making it impossible for people to protest legally in this country. So, you know, this backlash is beginning to take up steam, and we necessarily have, all of us globally who are engaged in this kind of thinking, have to do everything we can in order to push back against that. So I think critical race theory, as much as we see it as a political ploy, you know, for the base, the middle of this country, for those places that, you know, even in Charlottesville, you know, Charlottesville is thought of as a liberal community. You go 1 mile and you're in Trump country. So, you know, you have Charlottesville School versus Albemarle County schools, and it's definitely problematic.
Yeah. Now we have a lot of questions, but I want to follow up on this with you, Dr. Douglas, simply on the fact that when I think about it historically, you know, we had Reconstruction and that was overturned. Okay, and that witnessed a significant empowerment of people of African Americans. And then people often refer to the civil rights movement. There's often referred to by historians as a second Reconstruction, right? Are we witnessing in over a much longer period the overturning of the second Reconstruction? Can we think as pessimistically as that?
I think we could, yeah. I think the attack on the Voting Rights Act that has happened over the course of the last 3 years suggests that. The limitations on, you know, last year in one voting place, they closed 100 voting locations in Black neighborhoods. They're targeting this the ability for Black and Brown people to vote in this country. And I think that what the difference may be is that we're a much more informed populace than we once were about these issues. And so that may very well be the difference in terms of the activism that is ongoing. And the advent of social media helps in that regard. But I do believe that we are in a critical moment in this country that demands that we all be as vigilant as we can to whatever machinations are forthcoming. The interesting part of all of this too is when you talk about the civil rights movement, and you even think about the ways in which the civil rights movement really represented Black assimilation more than anything else. It was not integration, it was assimilation. And so here we are at this moment where we're have gone through, I would say, easily the last 9, 10 years of making real strides to create space for conversations such as the ones that we're having today. If in fact that these middle term elections really allow for a kind of Republican ascendancy, then we're in trouble here, I think.
Okay. A sort of a related question from the other end, as we're talking about opposition to issues such as discussion of racism, reparations, and so forth. We have a question in the chat that says, are there allies who can walk with the community on this path to justice and reparations?
Yeah, and that's something we need to put on the table in a more forceful way. If you look at the debate, for example, in 2006, I think October 2006 at the United Nations, it was around about the time of the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, and the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines introduced the motion at the United Nations. And you look at the debate as to who were contributing to what. And you can see with some of the Asian countries, Latin American countries. I'm talking about Latin America, for example, countries like Argentina. We know Argentina did have enslavement. We know they have a small Black population, but there is the notion that they didn't have enslavement. We look at those countries and you see in there the kind of solidarity that has developed in standing and making the case, supporting the African and Caribbean country for enslavement. You see the necessity for allies. There's no question in my mind that European and North American intransigence, for example, to come to the reparation table in view of the very modest and polite diplomatic approach CARICOM have taken, inviting them to the table, and they have not even as much as acknowledged the letter. No doubt in my mind.
And Cikiah, before you go on, just so people who might not know, CARICOM refers to the Caribbean community of countries.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is probably the leading areas of reparation struggle at this moment in terms of institutional building, advocacy, and so on and so forth. And I'm saying that the North American European countries, the intransigence to even attempted to even have a discussion, show that the reparation movement do need allies. And so I'm worried about some of these little narrow nationalistic view of how they see reparation. I have to say, by getting allies, we are going to lose focus, or we no longer have the ability to think and map out a good reparation agenda. I think we do need allies. I think there are some goodwill people in some of those countries. As I said, like I saw India and Pakistan and some of those countries contribute. And when I'm talking about the record is there at the United Nations. You could get the United Nations website. You could see the contribution that made by different people, different scholars. So yes, we do need allies.
Okay. Delvina or Dr. Douglas?
Yeah. I think generally it would be naive to think that a situation that wasn't created by us would be solved only by us. Clearly, put my camera back on, sorry about that. A situation that wasn't created solely by us ought not be solved by us, that we need to engage international, national partners, individuals, global leaders in this issue of reparatory justice. I mean, as Brother Cikiah could detail in better detail than myself, could outline in better detail than myself, the Durban conference, and when they were on the floor of trying to get that motion passed about reparatory justice, it was, you know, nations, other nations, brown nations that came to the rescue to be able to get the motion passed about being able to discuss reparations at the UN. So clearly other nations, many of whom have also struggled at the hands of European colonialists, that will certainly come forward to come to the aid of the issue of reparations, not just Black reparations, because we know India and so many other countries in Asia, etc., have also been colonized and marginalized by that. But when it comes to allies, I think we ought to at least be very mindful about our history in terms of when we've engaged others in our go forward plans. We know that during the civil rights movement, many others who were also part of their own rights revolutions, whether it was women issues, whether it was anti-war movement, whether it was the struggle for gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, etc. Many of these other communities, marginalized communities, joined forces with people of African descent during civil rights time to promote our issues. But we know that as they elevated their conditions, people went off into their silos, into their own rights revolutions. And we got left behind in those situations. So I would say we ought to learn from that history in terms of, and be very selective about when and where others enter into our issue, our strategy toward reparatory justice, so that it doesn't get taken over or forgotten or neglected after other people, you know, sort of triumph their own goals that they might be trying to attain. So I would just say that we really need to study that, fundamentally study that, because it has been a recurring theme in recent African history. Whenever we try to overcome situations, we invite people in, almost inviting saviors into our community, and only to find ourselves disappointed in the end. So I would caution us as we begin to look at that issue.
Dr. Douglas?
I mean, I wholeheartedly believe that we should be thinking about allyship. I think that the notion of particularly in America, of oppression of Native people, of Black people, and certainly you can say that there are cross purposes here. But I think that in terms of the ideas that we've been talking about miseducation, undereducation, the lack of public health facilities, all of those things are shared, all of those disparities are shared, certainly in this country, by Native peoples as well. And so if there were a way to begin to articulate and band together so that you are moving against the majority that is defined by capital gain. When you think about, for instance, something like a pipeline, right? At the same time that Standing Rock was occurring, we were all working toward against the sort of neo-Nazi nationalism that was increasing beginning in 2013 in its movement. And so at that particular moment, looking at that particular issue around pipeline, you could see the place where allyship was able to, up to a certain level, was able to cause a critical moment to not occur. Certainly Trump came along and then opened the pipeline problem back again, but certainly I don't think that the Native peoples acting alone would have been able to accomplish all that they had done at that point. So I think that it's important that as you look for allyships, that you are strategic about those places where you create alliances. In agreement with Delvina, you must be certainly strategic. But I think that this kind of problem, when you're thinking that there is a majority population that has created the deficits for a
singular minority population, the creation of allyship gives you a larger force to work with, and a broader set of ideas and strategies to work with in terms of problem resolution. So I believe that we should be thinking about allyship. I don't know that our reparations problem in America can be solved solely alone by Black people, to be honest. I just don't think there's enough of us.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. We're almost finished. We only got 2 minutes left. There's a number of questions, obviously, we won't get through. There's a question by Kwame Fraser, who wanted us to elaborate on the links between European, Canadian financiers, insurers, shipbuilders, etc., and the slave trade, and who were the Canadian co-conspirators in that. I'd just like to point out to him that we're now beginning to elaborate on Canada's link to what I call the transatlantic slave system. And in fact, if you go to the Lord Dalhousie report, which is available on the Lord Dalhousie site, we sort of link at least the beginning of this discussion of Canada into the financial circuits, right? There are questions on the role of the United Nations in reparations, not only in a decade, but particularly in providing a framework, right, by which perhaps we can have the kind of reparations that take place. And there were other questions that focused specifically on, for example, reparations and climate change. We know the conference is taking place in Scotland with climate change. One of the things that Sir Hilary Beckles has focused on, and I encourage people to come to his keynote lecture, which will be taking place in just over an hour. So you have an hour break before you come to it, but he's focused on that reparations necessarily is central to wrestling with the question of climate change. Obviously, it was the international economic system that emerged out of decolonization, destruction of indigenous peoples, and the transatlantic slave trade that created a system that has devastated the ecology, right? So I wish we could get to all of these questions. Our panelists have been here for, over 2 hours because they were here 15 minutes before the session began. I know they must be tired, and I wish we could have gotten to all of your questions, but I think the question and answer period, together with the presentations, the formal presentations were extremely rich. We have recorded the sessions, and these will be made available at some point so people can revisit them and they can once again dip into the rich discussions and so forth. I don't know if our panelists would like to have any final brief, and I stress the word brief, closing comments about the necessity of reparations in the 21st century, if there's anything else to add. Perhaps we can start with Delvina, Cikiah, and then our guest from the United States, Dr. Douglas.
Well, I want to end on a positive note, but this has a little tincture of sting in it, which is to say that I think that reparations, reparatory justice, without a theoretical underpinning of Afrocentricity will be ill-fated. That's my final remark. And
Cikiah?
Yeah, I would encourage it. One question we didn't get a chance to delve into because of the time constraint is the connection between Canadian industry and slave trade. It's huge, the minefield that needs to be studied about the relationship between Canada and the Caribbean, especially in Nova Scotia in particular. That was the transshipment point from the Caribbean for sugar and molasses. Is a huge component. And when you look at that, what is important about it is it really underscored the importance of us having to struggle against xenophobia. It's critical that we begin to see it in the global context and don't see it in our narrow geographical confines. And that's a very important piece of the work that needs to be done. That's a connection between the Caribbean, for example, Europe development, Caribbean and the development, Europe development, as well as what's happening in Nova Scotia. So again, in different parts, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and so on, and many of the other ports that was built to facilitate the European trade. So let me encourage everybody to pay key attention to different parts, because reparations are a big ship, and it means a lot of people with different skills to get into this huge tent to make our own contribution towards making reparation a reality, so our people can begin to take a holistic approach to the problem we have.
Okay. Dr. Douglas?
Yeah, going last is a privilege, because I get to say things like, yes, exactly what they said. But I am in total agreement with what they said. But I do think for America, it's really important that we do, as has been said, is really begin to start to think of this as a pan-global process, as opposed to thinking of it as solely happening in America. Because I honestly think that what we're missing here is the numbers. It's the swell of the voices speaking in one voice, to really sort of drive home what the implications of enslavement have been, and what these inequities that are not solved, and the implications not just for Black people, but for the globe. You know, if you're not living with communities that can thrive, then really no one thrives. And if we don't press that point, I'm not sure we'll be able to get as far as we hope. There's got to be something in it for everyone, honestly, for people to get on board with it, or to believe that way, whether we actually believe it or not, to be honest.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. Thank you, panelists. It's been a great pleasure, I think, for all of us, even though we've discussed a topic that involves so much oppression and injustice. As many of you know, this virtual event, this webinar, is part of a series of virtual events in our build-up to the 2023 conference sponsored by the University Studying Slavery that will be taking place in Halifax in the fall of 2023. Hopefully, we will be doing it in person. And so we have other virtual events that will be taking place. There will be more discussions, more places for people to have their questions answered. And so therefore, stay tuned with our pre-conference and conference events that will be taking place. Obviously, the next major one is the keynote by Sir Hilary Beckles on reparations. I think that is going to be an incredibly brilliant presentation, and he will be followed by our discussant, Afua Cooper. Then we'll have question and answers. So I think this is going to be very important. Dr. Sir Hilary Beckles, Dr. Afua Cooper, a question and answer period. And I think the struggle for a better world necessarily encompasses the issue of reparations, which is more than just compensation. It's really about a new vision for a world that's fit for all human beings. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for giving so much of your time. Thank you for the audience for sharing your questions. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to all of your questions, but hopefully, you know, when you see the recordings, when you come to other events, you'll find the questions that may not have been directly answered today to actually have some form of address in later events as well. Thank you so much, and hopefully to see you at the keynote by Sir Hilary Beckles. Thank you so much again.